Hi everyone, I'm Dave Cass and welcome to this webinar which is part of the Maastricht School of Management's Masterclass series. Now I'm going to start with the disclaimer. Yesterday we conducted the webinar, but unfortunately the recording was corrupted. So today I'm re-recording and looking through the slide pack, so you'll get that screen capture. I also have the questions that were asked on paper, so I will also be able to ask those questions that came through the webinar, so you're going to lose nothing. Now, when we talk about wage negotiation, that creates a feeling of tension immediately for many people, the whole thought of being involved in wage negotiation, that sort of fight or flight feeling in us. And the problem is that when we're stressed like that, we're liable to either forget our preparation, or we're going to react in a negotiation in a way that's completely counter to the best way of speaking to the person that's on the other side of the table. In fact, at MSM, one of the things that we do in our negotiation classes is make sure that there's a wage negotiation, either face-to-face or an email, really high-quality scenario, because it's really important that people get experience of this. And because we focus on personality, people learn that under stress, you're liable to go to the personality which you're most comfortable with, and that could be completely the wrong type of that style of negotiation. So fortunately for our students, they get to practice it quite a lot. You don't, so this are pointers, hopefully extra little bits that will help you in any wage negotiation you may have in the future. So let's get into it. So what we're going to do is look at wage negotiation through three personality lenses. The first one on the left is Jane, and she's representing new graduates, but equally she could just be representing anybody that's going in for a job interview and will be negotiating the wage in that. John, on the other hand, he's been working in a company for about 7 years, never ever asked for a salary raise in his life, and he's going to do it for the first time. And finally, on the right, we have Linda here. She's been a manager for some 20 years. Nobody in that time has ever asked her for a salary increase, but it's about to happen. And so we'll examine wage negotiation through these different lenses. One of the most common questions I get asked by graduates, particularly towards the graduation date, and they're looking at jobs, is should I negotiate? And I always say that it really depends. If you are given a job offer which you think is correct and fair, I'm talking about the whole package, then just accept it. You shouldn't have an automatic sort of flop to I have to negotiate. That's not what it's about. However, if there is something that you're not happy about, then absolutely you should negotiate. So let's have a look and see the differences it can mean. Now, these figures I took from straight from Google, and the average salary for a graduate in Amsterdam apparently is 31,600, and the increase per year in salaries is 2% in the Netherlands. And for this example, we'll cover 40 years and just see what happens in time. So this is somebody who did not see this webinar, isn't really happy with the offer that's been given, but because they're scared of the risks of negotiation, doesn't and accepts the job. So this is what they end up with. So starting salary of this, after 40 years, that's what their final salary will be. And the sum of all their earnings is this amount. Now let's look at it through the prism of Jane. So she has watched this webinar. She's equally unhappy as the other person about the job offer. It's the exact same job. But because she's seen this webinar, she's going to negotiate. And so she negotiates actually quite a modest increase, so less than €300 increase to take her salary up to 35,000. But then look at the difference that happens in the final salary at 75,000. And what's important about this is not just the delta when you look at it there, but all those years of difference is a very large accumulation of pensions input every month going in. And so actually you are going to see a massive difference for the rest of their lives just in the pension, so even after they've worked. Also, this example is a little false because it assumes two people who will stay in the same jobs and working for 40 years in the same company. Now, we know that people have portfolio careers and they move from job to job, but the wage that you have in your previous job actually does have an influence in the negotiation and where you might get in your next job. So actually, the difference between these two could increase massively throughout their lives. So let's just see what the total earnings are in this situation. And here you see a very major difference in the sum total that Jane would get just because she was prepared to negotiate that less than 300 increase, which isn't very much. So the straight answer to should I negotiate is if you're happy, then don't. It's not a competition. But if you're unhappy, clearly there's a lot of money to be made and don't be shy of negotiating. I should also say that many people stay away from negotiation in the job interview. And by the way, this is absolutely the time to negotiate. It's expected because they think if I negotiate, then perhaps they won't offer me the job. Statistics show that actually there's only a fraction of companies would stop a job offer because somebody actually negotiated. More to do with the way that you negotiate and the manner that you deal with them. And to be honest, if a company didn't give you a job offer simply because you had the nerve to negotiate, that probably isn't a company that you wanted to work for anyway. So if you're going to be unhappy with the offer, you have to base it on something. And the starting point is actually understanding how much you are worth. And you're extremely fortunate in your generation because that mobile device in your hands, I mean, if you look at most intelligence agencies up until a few years ago would kill for the information that you can easily get at your fingertips now. And these are some of the locations that I've looked at. You can find out comparative job skills. But here's the really important thing, in that you must make sure you're comparing like with like. So it's not just the job position, but also the responsibilities. Also, you remember that in the same country, you may have a different wage scale in one city in comparison to another. And also you might be crossing state lines. For instance, I live in Germany, but I work in the Netherlands. And so there's a completely different tax system compared to Germany. So the important point here is you have to compare net, not gross salaries. How much are you actually getting at the end of the day? And that way you'll be comparing like with like. But also, where else can we look to try and get information about jobs? Well, here's one for you. I wonder how many of you would think of actually picking the phone up and asking somebody to tell you their wage. Wonder what you think the probability of success is. Well, there's been quite a lot of work on this. Unsurprisingly, the figure is 27%. So that's better than 1 in 4 chance that somebody will actually tell you how much they're being paid. Now, that variation that you're seeing there is because it varies depending on which sector, industry sector that you're in. But obviously, it will change from country to country as well. Some are more liable to tell you the information than the others. But your chances of going from 27% to 45%, really that depends on you and the way you approach the person and ask the question. It still astounds me that people on LinkedIn just message, or they don't message, they send me a link with no information about them or why I should be interested in them other than be grateful that they've reached out to me. It's not Facebook. So if you treat this in that sort of style, then your chances are absolutely zero. Be professional, be friendly, and ask for help. And you can see that it's actually a very good chance that somebody will help you. Now let's move on to gender bias. And when I show this slide, many of you might be thinking about the gender gap in wages, which exists. It's dreadful, but that's not what I'm looking at. And also you may have thought gender bias, the bias of the interviewer. So in negotiation, more likely to give way to a man than a woman. I'm not looking at that either. There was a study done about 2 years ago in Germany, and they consulted 31,000 graduates or soon-to-be graduates. And they asked them what their wage expectations are. So when I'm talking about gender bias, it's a bias between people, what their expectations, what they're wanting out of life after graduating. And there's actually quite an interesting difference. So looking at the male side, they're expecting that sort of difference in comparison to the females. Now, some of that will be driven by the subjects that they're studying, perhaps, and therefore a higher wage expectation. But nonetheless, there is a clear difference in what people are expecting. Also, from statistics, males tend to overvalue themselves in the market in comparison to females. And finally, males will gauge against future requirements. Now, what do I mean by this as a difference? If you take your average male and provide a job specification for him, he'll look at it, take off the points that he meets, and then any areas that he doesn't, he will see himself fitting into those spaces. So he imagines himself being capable of doing them. So he's filling in the gaps, or is prepared to fake it until he makes it. Females, on the other, what they tend to do is look at the job specification, look at what they're qualified to do now, and look for the differences. So you have a completely different way of looking at things. One, how can I'm positive I can fill these in. Another one, there's a difference. Now, if you take all these three lines together, what you can say is there is a clear difference between the sexes about the way that they will approach negotiation, and that the male, given those three things, is more likely to be dissatisfied with the first offer that he's given, and therefore more likely to negotiate. And of course, we do know already that the worst that can happen in a negotiation is no. The best probably is some sort of increase or other. So that's part of the difference. So when we talk about how much am I worth, I have to show this because he died last week, but you really need to bring out that inner spy, the inner bond, and really do a lot of research. Remember, getting a job, there are no silver medals, there's only gold medals. So you've got to put in gold medal work when you're doing your research. And for myself, when I am going for a job interview, I probably take 4 days of studying and research before I actually go into the interview. Think about the last time that you went for a job interview and how much you did. Could make a big difference. So let's consider what happens when we are applying to get an interview. And actually, so before you even get to this interview stage, you may be on the forms, the application forms, asked to give an expectation of salary. Now, there are a number of ways you may wish to do this. You could leave it blank if the form lets you. Nowadays, most forms don't. You might get away with it. But the problem with that is, of course, that you may be seen as actually not being that good because you couldn't even fill out a form. And we must remember also that many companies will have the first filter done by a third-party company. And so if there's any reason that your form doesn't match their profile, what they're looking for, like something not being filled in, you could immediately end up with your application in the bin. So that's a pretty high risk maneuver. What you could write, if the form will allow you, is negotiable. But what you really, ideally, you should have done some homework and have a pretty good idea and put in the range that you think is acceptable, even if it's only with your very quick research, and you'll follow up with more research later on. Remember, what we're trying to do here, the application, is get to interview. So you're trying to make sure you don't exclude yourself. At the same time, you can't come up with silly sums because otherwise they'll just discount you. So let's say you actually get to interview. In fact, even before this face-to-face, it's highly likely that you'll be in a telephone interview as well. You'll hopefully have done more research. And remember again, everything you're doing is to make sure that you can get to the equivalent of the face-to-face interview. So important when they ask about the wages and things that you've asked questions and you set what you think is a decent range. And range is the key word here, because there's an overlap between what their range is and yours, then you're not stopping yourself from being included on that subject, assuming you're good for interview. But let's just take it in this example that well done, congratulations, you've made it to the interview process. So actually, You've been as cool as a cucumber. The interview has been going fantastically. No problems at all. And then comes the question, as it's being posed now, is how much do you want? And immediately your heart starts beating and the adrenaline starts flowing through your body. So what do we do? Well, the most important thing is to give that impression of, yeah, I'm flexible, but what you're trying to do is push this conversation so that they're actually the ones that are coming out with a sum or an idea first of all. So you can, for instance, say, well, thank you very much. I know it's a really good company, but I'm still interested in more information before we discuss that, or I'm interested in what you think. But key here is offering a range, and I've already mentioned that. You're trying to create an overlap because in that overlap is where the negotiation will be played. So it makes it quite clear. Now, if you happen to have been coming from a job already and you're going into another job, similar sort of job, then actually you've already got a salary to base your requirements on, so you're not starting from a blank piece of paper. However, it may also have been that you wanted to leave your job because you weren't happy with the salary that you were being given. So in that case, what is the salary you would have asked if you were staying with the company? And then use that as your baseline for the range that you would have. Very important is only give numbers that you're happy with. And there's a great temptation, and I understand particularly in COVID times, if you've already written out 100 applications, this is the one interview you've got, and therefore there's a temptation to try and sell yourself low in the hope that you'll be given the job. Problem is that you might sell yourself so low that the company thinks you don't value yourself and they don't give you the job. The other point is if you get the job and you've offered a range which you're not happy with, then you're never going to be unhappy in that job and you're never really going to be working hard at it. So therefore, only negotiate with sums that you're happy with. But remember, you're still at the competition stage here. Nobody has offered you a job. So the real important point is to remind them of how you could be the perfect fit, why you should get the job, highlight the reasons why, and the value you will bring. But yes, you have to be prepared to negotiate. But also it's important to remember that the people sat at this table may not be the people that actually decide the wage, the final wage. So again, be careful how you push it. So let's say you've been asked a question. Well, here's an example of what might be a pretty good answer. And so, again, you've pushed the discussion a little bit, saying, you've done your research, you know that with the experience, this is what should be paid. And what you're doing is offering them really the opportunity to talk and for you to listen. And this is a key point, that pregnant pauses, so that let them fill those in. You don't have to fill those in. And if you can do that, then that will help you because they'll give more detail away and you'll understand your negotiating position a lot better. So this is one answer, and here's another as well. Again, what we're trying to achieve here is to push it back. The difference, and the subtle difference in this one, is though you're giving them a clear idea that yes, I do know I've done my research, and therefore for these reasons this is what I should be paying, should be getting paid. Now, you haven't actually declared that's your position. You're merely stating this is what the industry standard is as you understand it. Let them fight that. You can just sit back and wait. Let them do the discussions. So far we've talking about the things that you should say, but what about the things that you shouldn't? And absolutely avoid giving a set amount. So keep to that range, because when you set a fixed amount, first of all, it could be under what their range, and they'll say yes, nightmare scenario. But also gives an impression of being combative, and you don't. You want to be working with this together and giving that impression all the time that it's collaborative, not combative. But I've mentioned this before. Don't price yourself out of the job. So don't deliberately set yourself too high, and don't deliberately set yourself too low. It's a false premise if you try and go too low. Interesting, I've been doing job interviews now for a long time and spoken to a lot of people. And it's quite interesting if your initial job offer to somebody for a job is below what their expectations were. And quite often, the body language and the face will tell you everything that that person is thinking. And this is really quite important here. So even though the first offer may be something you think, I wouldn't get out of bed for that, you can't let that relay through your body and your face or the manner of speaking. So always be positive. You can always counter, but it's really important to remember that you still haven't been offered the job yet. There's 10 other people perhaps behind you yet to be interviewed. So you want to be presenting yourself as a young, keen individual that will fit in the team. So don't be negative at any time. Now here's one that's really important as well. And that is, if somebody says, no question, this is the best value offer we can do, then don't negotiate for that wage, because they've already told you that you really come over as being dull and not listening if somebody says this is it, and then you say, yeah, but I'd like 500 more. So there may be other things to talk about other than the money, but be aware of what you're saying and what you're doing, and do not annoy the people interviewing you. Really important. And you still haven't been offered a job yet, at which you can further negotiate. So let's imagine you have been successful and you've beaten the other 10 people to the competition, and a job offer comes to you at home. Now, how are you going to negotiate from that point? Well, there are two schools of thought. One is based on mobile or video, and the other is an email. And so I'm going to cover some benefits or thoughts about both of these, and I'll also mention what my personal preference is for you to base your own decisions on. One of the problems with email is that, it is really easy to interpret wrongly. I'm sure many of you will have experienced this. You've written an email, but maybe you wrote sloppily, or whatever it was that you thought was very clear, and other people take offense. It happens. So this can be a problem with email in comparison to a spoken conversation. One of the key pluses, if you like, from working from a mobile phone or with video is that you've got that connection. You can actually build up more trust because you're talking to each other. It can be easier to negotiate. And of course, you can pick up, for instance, if you can see somebody, you can pick up on their body languages. So there are cues that will help you in your negotiation. However, there are some negatives to doing that as well, and some big benefits from negotiating via email. And the first one is that email gives you time to think. Now, in a wage negotiation, who is going to have the most experience in wage negotiation? The person from the company, or the person trying to get the person trying to get the job? Invariably, it's going to be the person from the company. So because of this inexperience that you've got, you don't want to just blurt out yes. And so therefore, you really need time to think and to consider things. And that's always a good idea. So I like email, particularly for that. But the other important point is that email allows you that time to structure a logical counteroffer rather than perhaps saying something or blurting something out on the phone. There's also a very great difference in the way that you're going to be reacting in a phone conversation as well. So you're liable to be more tense, under more tension or stress than you would be in an email negotiation. But there are pros and cons to both. Personally, I prefer to negotiate via email at this point, and it might be that's followed up afterwards with some videos, but I certainly find I like the time to think about an offer. So let's assume that we are going to respond to an offer by email that we're not happy with, and let's say that we actually know the market. Well, here's an example of a response that works. So the first paragraph, you're reinforcing why they decided you should get the gold medal and be ahead of everybody else. Also, this is quite important to remember when negotiating, that there will also have somebody on standby as well. So you were first choice, but there's still somebody behind you. So you want to remind people before you negotiate about why they picked you and the value you're bringing. In the middle paragraph, you want to show them how excited you are. They've nearly got you, but guess what? they're not quite matching what would be the normal standard in industry, or for whatever reason, qualifications you've got and the demands for the job. And finally, you're rounding off your email in a nice way, in reminding as well, of course, that it's something that's got to be beneficial for both of you. So it's a collaborative effort. You're not trying to mess them around. You're not trying to play hardball, but it's something that you needs to be done as you as part of their team. Really quite important. So that's if you've got some sort of facts and you're unhappy. What about if you're in a really nice position, and that is that you've already got a job offer? Now, the first paragraph I haven't changed. It's identical to the last one. But here, there's some keywords that I use. And competitor is an important word in this. So again, they've nearly got you on the hook. It just needs to go that little bit extra. And because you've introduced the word competitor, that has a psychological click, if you like, in many people's brains. And it means that it engages them, it almost gamifies it to a certain extent, that they want to engage and they want to beat a competitor. It's almost like that enthusiasm in eBay when you can't stop bidding because you've got to beat somebody else rather than thinking of the value. So you're trying to create that little hint in the mindset which is going to help you. Again, you're the third paragraph, you're stressing this, we're working together, you're being polite, and you're being upbeat. And in the final paragraph again, that you're suggesting that it's a really good job and they've nearly got you. He hardly needs to go much further, and then he's got you landed and he's got you in the job. So that's a couple of examples of perhaps to do it by email. Now, we have been talking purely about wages, so let's look at some other things you might want to consider in the negotiation. And although this first symbol actually is with money, there are certain elements that you might want to think other than just the base wage. For instance, in my last job, Amazon, shares were part of it, so there may be a share deal that you want to negotiate. You may be in a job where there are bonuses, for instance, often in sales, there are bonuses for sales, so you might want to negotiate what that percentage is going to be above your base rate. If you are coming from a job previously into this job, very often there's quite a lot of costs involved just in that transfer, and many companies, if you are willing to negotiate, might have almost a golden welcome or a lump sum welcome for you to help you in that transition. That could be something to consider. Is that available? Is that something that needs to be negotiated? Now, if at the end of the day they say, look, we can't go any further, negotiating something like an early annual appraisal might be something that's really useful, say at the 6-month point, because that gets you the possibility of getting a fractional percentage increase earlier than having to wait a year. So it's bringing it forward. Or if you're really unhappy, it might be, well, I think we need to, and you need this in writing, we need to renegotiate the 6-month point. Now, if after 6 months you've done a really good job, they think you're a star, then you've got a really good negotiating position, particularly if you've got it in writing, that at the 6-month point there will be a renegotiation of wage. Nobody, your line manager or HR, will want to have to go through the HR process to find somebody if you're doing a fantastic job after 6 months. So that's worth remembering. But here's an important point, and it's a real false friend, is don't assume that because you have experience that could have been higher for the job. So let's say you're going for a level 2 job, but actually you've got experience of level 4. Don't assume that because you take this level 2 job, after a year, you get your annual appraisal and suddenly people will jump you up to sort of level 4 position or level 4 wages. And some people think that. It's really a false thinking here. It's not going to happen. So be careful and make sure you don't undersell yourself. You're not going to get big raises. You're going to get percentage raises for doing a good job. Now, for many graduates, the commuting time to get to university has been practically negligible. And I was looking in Germany the other week, they were saying that the average commute to work is 1 hour now in Germany. And actually, for me, traveling to Maastricht is exactly 1 hour. But let's just say you wanted to negotiate flexi time, so you could travel to work outside of rush hour and back from rush hour. And my experience of London, there's 3 million people. This is before COVID, of course. 3 million people commuting into London. And it's actually not much fun in rush hour. But let's say in your commute, you could reduce your commute to work by 7.5 minutes, so saving 15 minutes a day. Well, over a year, that's how many hours you can save. So that's something else that you could be doing. Or even if you would be doing work in your commute, it can make the difference between 56 hours a year standing in a train like a sardine in rush hour, or actually being able to find a seat if you're going in half an hour later to work and you've got a seat and you're more comfortable for your commute and for the rest of the year. That has serious value, and you may never have considered that if you've not really had to do much commuting before. Education is really important and for everyone through life learning, and so therefore you want to be pressing and finding out what educational options are available. It could be that you could negotiate the opportunity to a major course earlier than would be the norm, but you need to be thinking about the courses that could be available to you, and also the perks. I show a gym here because that's quite a common one. But equally, depending on what country you are, where you are, it could be a dental plan, a medical plan, you name it. But what you need to do is you need to cover the whole thing, because although you've got your base wage, you want to be talking about your salary, your overall salary, the complete package. And that's what you should be negotiating. Now, this has been an extraordinary year. And of course, we've had this little beastie to deal with. And so, actually, a very common question I get asked as well because of this is, should I negotiate? The reason for this is because people are scared to negotiate because they think they might, by asking or trying to negotiate for a wage, they might kick themselves off the job offer. And as I've mentioned before, just because of coronavirus doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't negotiate. Some companies have done extremely well in the coronavirus times, others have not. But if it's a good company, you still have a range and you should still be able to negotiate. But here's something that's really quite important. So normally you'd be doing your research and perhaps you'd be looking at data which might be a year, 18 months old. Now what you're going to have to do is really focus on what's happened within the company this year. Actually, it would be perfectly reasonable in my mind for you to contact the company and even before your interview and say, could you please send me some information about what's been happening in the company and actually what's been happening with the job role as well, because things may have changed in the role in comparison to perhaps the way it was advertised. Now, because of coronavirus, it's highly likely that instead of a face-to interview that you will have a video interview. The problem with a video interview is that it's much harder to build up trust than it is when you're face to face. And so how do we get around this? Because actually building trust enables you to negotiate better between the pair of you. One of the things I suggest is if you're coming from having worked in a previous job, is in your application, if there is a requirement to provide references, actually provide your HR in your current job as one of those references. It's unusual, but what it does, it cuts through an awful lot of the trust issue before you get to interview, because they are dealing with your HR department. And this will, assuming of course you've been doing a good job, this will help in the interview and help in that sort of negotiations. Before coronavirus, though, it might be that you would have been able to negotiate for a wide range of things in the job negotiation. Now, because of the impacts on companies, you really need to consider what's the most important thing for you and base your negotiation on that and fight for that. So don't do a scattergun approach. But again, and I keep going on about this, lead with probing questions. So they're the ones that are doing the talking and you've got a really good idea of the fit and the value that you would be breaking, because actually you need to have a logical argument, particularly so in COVID times, on why they should be raising what they thought was a reasonable initial offer. So taking everything that I've said in account, what are the key takeaways for somebody who's into a job? First and foremost, you've got to do your research, and it's got to be seriously good quality and in-depth research, because you need to know what your value is, because that's what you can base your negotiation on. Never go below your bottom line. So unless there's some qualification or something so special about working in this company that you might actually work for something that was a lot lower, then don't go below your bottom line. Remember, although it's wage negotiation, you're actually talking about overall salary and everything that's part of it. So you could actually, there are maybe things not to do with money which are more valuable to you than just dollars, euros, whatever going into your bank account. So think about those. Most importantly, remember the negotiation stage is still in the job select. They are still selecting you for the job. So be polite. It's serious. Be businesslike and be friendly. But if you argue with facts and data, it's very hard to argue against facts, good data. So use it. You've done your research, so use it. And really importantly, don't make it a competition. Now, if you are a sort of person that is really highly competitive, then you've got to try and stop yourself, your natural tendency to want to be aggressive or to want to compete. Because what will happen is you will filter yourself out of the opportunity of getting this job. Unless, of course, it's a job that needs highly competitive people. But throughout the whole of this, you needs to be collaborative. And it's very important that the person you're negotiating with feels that they've done a good negotiation, given a bit, but they come out of it feeling that they've done a pretty good job as well. And giving them a hard time and making it competitive, absolutely no chance. You're not going to get the job. Now let's come on to John. And as I said, he has been in the company for 7 years now. He's married, got a second child on the way. He's having struggle paying his mortgage, and he's got an expensive car to pay for as well. None of that has anything whatsoever to do with why he should be asking for a pay raise in terms of dealing with his manager. Nothing to do with that. That's external to the company. So actually, what are we going to do for John, who's never negotiated before? Interestingly, I wonder if you've ever negotiated. Well, let's have a look at the percentages, and you look at where you are in this and you'll see there's a very high probability that you won't have negotiated before. Interestingly, you look at these figures, but actually over 90% of people would like professional negotiation courses, partly to do with wage, but in general as well. So there's actually a great appetite out there to learn for something that people have never done, and it will definitely be out of their comfort zone if they have to do it. So when looking at salary negotiations, is there a position bias? And the answer is yes. So if you have been in a company for, say, 5 years, you're 3.4 times more likely to get a wage raise than somebody who is in their first year. So it kind of goes exponentially through the years. So that makes a difference. But also your role within a company. So a manager is 40% more likely than the people below him to get a salary increase if he asks for it. And a director is 114% more likely than somebody who isn't in a management role of getting a salary increase. So there's a clear position bias in success rate when asking for a salary increase. Is there a gender bias? Yes, there is. There's first of all quite a notable gender bias in who will ask for a raise and who won't. Men tend to ask for a raise or to get salary increases by asking for a wage increase, staying in the company, in other words. But for females, it's actually almost like I expect a wage increase or salary increase by changing jobs. So again, there's a very different way of looking at things. But there is a clear, sadly, gender bias and success in negotiation as well. Males tend to be more successful than females. What's also interesting is that if you have to play hardball in negotiation, a male will probably be treated as, well, that's kind of competitive, that's okay, but it can have a greater negative effect on a female if she has to play hardball. Even if it's with facts and figures, it just has a sort of a stigma attached to it. So there's, unfortunately, is a clear gender bias. But if you're going to be successful, what do we have to do? Well, you have to bear in mind all the things that we've spoken about for somebody for a job interview, and it's a similar sort of case here. So you have to build your case in a logical way. Now, you are fortunate because you should know your company inside out. You should have had key performance indicators or targets given to you by your line manager to try and achieve, and therefore you should have a good idea whether you've overachieved or not in comparison to your job specification. Remember this, we're not just saying that you're doing a good job and you deserve your normal increase. This is you over and above, so a major salary increase. And the other thing I would say here is that although you are looking at it as an individual, and therefore, your absolute focus, that when you come to your manager and the management chain, they are treating you as an individual, but they have to consider your case across the whole of the company. So remember that. You're thinking individual, they're thinking company effects. But anyway, build your case up clear and logically. And also, exactly like somebody going for a job, you need to know your worth. Now, you have a key advantage here because although you could go to websites, within your industry, you would expect to have been in there a certain amount of time and actually be pretty well networked. So you should have a very clear idea in your mind what the going rate is for the sort of job that you're doing in your industry or actually in your competitors. An important point to think about as well is what are you worth if they lose you? Are you a key player that they couldn't afford to lose? Does the house of cards fall down if you leave? If that's so, then obviously your negotiating position is an awful lot stronger. But a word of warning in that, you will always overvalue your worth. And if you're the sort of person that's competitive and sort of says, well, if you don't give me that wage, I'm going to leave, be prepared for them to turn around and say, fine, there's your 30 days notice. Thank you very much, you're off. So be very careful about how competitively you negotiate, but also be careful of overvaluing yourself. So that's how to prepare, but what about when to ask? There's some clear times when you would be expected. So during your performance appraisal is one of those times where you're comparing against your performance indicators and everything else. So it would be reasonable to be talking about salaries then. But remember, we're talking about doing something special and outside or above your job spec, or it could be that the market's moved on from when you started in the job. So when you started in the job, it was comparable to the market. The market's moved on and your company just hasn't noticed. So those are things that are important. But if you're doing an above average job, but there may be lots of them, then you would be talking that sort of standard percentage increase rather than a major salary increase. If you've delivered a major project or increased something of great value, then clearly that is the time as well to raise the prospect of a salary increase, because everyone, the spotlight's on you at the moment. It's probably never going to be better than that. So if that's the time, then that is a really good one. And also, only go and ask for a salary increase when your boss actually is in a good mood. And it astounds me, it's happened throughout my life, how when I've been stressed and clearly been stressed that my office door's been closed or we've got something to do, people will still come and bang on my door and try and come in for the things that really aren't important. That's not to say that wage negotiation is not important, but you are trying to align the planets here and give yourself the best opportunity for success. And clearly, when your manager is stressed, there's no chance of that. So time it carefully and hopefully you'll get it through. But when you do see your manager, you need to know what you're looking for. And key to that also is expectation management by you. So you need to have a very clear understanding of your company processes and the possibility of getting that wage increase. For instance, if for your job, you are already in the top pay band for your job that the company will allow, and let's say it's like where I work in higher education in the Netherlands, where it's mandated what the bands are. If you're already in that top band and the top wage, it doesn't matter how often you say you're not going to be getting a wage increase. So you need to understand that, understand your company processes. And within your year, there'll be good times to bring this subject up as well. So you know your company best. You also should know how long it would take and what the process would be. So highly unlikely that your manager will be immediately turning around and saying yes or no to a wage increase. Who does he need to speak to? What needs to be done? Have that clearly in your mind, because expectation management is really important and will affect the way you deliver and the way you sit down in front of your boss and discuss it. This is important because for you, it's absolutely the reverse of somebody who is trying to negotiate when they're in job interview. So you need to be precise. And if you're precise, it actually adds weight to the whatever proof that you bring for the logic of your argument about why you should have a salary increase. So they match up. But the important thing is here is if you come out with, in this example, 52,000 to 55,000. So if you came to me asking for a salary increase, I have immediately read that range as 52,000 because you said you'd be happy with that. So I'm not even considering a single cent above your bottom line. So therefore, be precise. Really, really important. I'd also say that if you're making a verbal request, I've already said that your manager is highly unlikely to be able to say yes or no directly. So give him the data, give him a written brief. And it's giving you time to form your argument logically and pitch it with him, and then or she, so they have got something to reference to. So they can do their due diligence, they can work at it because they will be pitching a yes or no perhaps to somebody else, and they need that information. So always back it up with a written brief. Now, because of coronavirus, it's highly likely that if you are going to be asking for a raise, initially you'll be asking via email. So there's some things you need to think about here. First of all, in the subject line, you don't want to scare your manager off with your subject line of demanding a wage increase. So something like this, you're requesting a meeting and you're saying it's something important. I use compensation because actually that means more than wage. So you're not just talking about money, you're talking about a plethora of things. But you do actually, obviously in the body, you need to briefly, you don't need to go into great detail and write at all, but you need to write a good logical argument about why you think you deserve a salary. It could be that you've got new responsibilities you're taking on, or you brought new clients, or you've made so much more money because of what you're doing. There's a big delta into what's ever happened before. It could also be that you've got new skills and qualifications, and your manager may have no idea that you've suddenly got this professional skill that you've been working on for the past 2 years that could affect your wages. When people are working so hard now, it's easy to miss these things. So bear that in mind. It might be that your manager is not deliberately keeping you down in wages or whatever. Or HR, it's just they haven't noticed that you've got this qualification and its impact that it should have. Particularly important in some countries, if you've gone from, say, having a bachelor's degree or no degree and you've got a degree, or you go to master's, because in some countries it's mandated that the job has a minimum wage depending on your educational status. So that might have been missed, and that's a pretty good point to raise. But whatever you do, you need to make it formal and use a really good format. And sadly, we've got so used to writing quick emails, but now using Teams, using Slack, thanks to COVID, or whatever else, WhatsApp, we're actually writing quite informally. And this is not one of those occasions. So whatever you do, find a format. Maybe your company's actually got a standard format that you can use, but write it properly. If you treat it professionally, you will be treated as a professional in a professional way, by and large. So let's say we're asking for something with email, and we send an email out. Here's an example that you might want to use as an idea. So in the first paragraph, you're covering why you want to briefly what it's about and why. Then you're going to go into much more detail in the second paragraph. But throughout all this, although it's a professional tone, what you're trying to do again is we're going to be meeting, we're going to be working together on this, and you're upbeat. So the tone of your email is really important that it's upbeat. What else might we need to think about? Well, not just money. So thanks to COVID, many of us are working from home. But what's going to happen in the future? Well, I mentioned that the average person, certainly in Germany, is commuting 1 hour to work. So if I extrapolate that and say, well, I'll take my example. So instead of driving to Maastricht 5 days a week, we reduce it by 4. So I'm still working from home 1 day a week. So and I'm fortunate in this case because I can. There's no impact to the company, but I'm saving a phenomenal work. It's like 2 weeks extra holiday a year instead of me being sat in a car with perhaps no impact to the work environment and to your company. So that could be something major that's worth negotiating for. Now, you might get away with 1 day, but it might be that 2 days, 3 days, there's absolutely no chance of that. But think carefully about what can be saved in commuting time because that adds real value. If you're in a large company, it might be that there is a mentoring program, and this is quite useful for assisting you in getting through the career ladder, taking a wider picture. Pretty good indication if people say yes of the way that they're looking and valuing you. And often it's aligned with an education program. So if you can get these sorts of things, it's really helpful. It also might raise your profile in the correct circles if you're doing a good job, which wouldn't necessarily happen. So having a good mentor who's actually is doing the job of a good mentor for you will help you in so many ways other than just going up the career ladder. Thanks to COVID, many of us are spending our time in almost non-stop video conferences, and it's actually very difficult to get on and do the job that we're supposed to be paid for. And so if you've not come across this expression, deep work, it really means negotiating a time in the day or in the week where it's absolutely agreed across the company that you're not available to answer your emails, whatever injects that come into you, you are actually able to focus on your work. So you've cleared an area of time and space for you to get on and do what you want, and it's accepted. That is quite an important one these days, I think, to negotiate. If you're anything like me and it feels like your whole day has become nothing but video meetings. Also, you've got to think your career path, and nobody is responsible for your career other than you. So if you're going to, you want to progress, what are the steps that you might want for your career? Is there a project coming up that you perhaps weren't being considered for that you might want to be considered or take part in something? These are important things. So it could be, again, something that qualifies you in an area you've never been qualified before because, strangely, perhaps in the next job or the areas that you're looking for your future, that might be an important facet to have on your CV. So think about that. Overall then, looking at it for asking for a salary increase, most importantly, timing is everything. So you want to align, as I said, align the planets up so you have the best possible chance when you go in and speak to your manager. You do have to prepare to argue, and whatever you do, it's got to be business-like because it's a serious business asking for a pay salary over and above your peers. But remember, it's not all about money. There are some things which actually, if you think about it, are much more valuable than just getting some green things going into the bank. And here's one as well that you need to think about. Be prepared for no and think about what your reaction is going to be. So have that up your sleeve as well so that it's not an immediate shock if the answer is no. So let's look at the lens of our third personality, Linda, who's been working for 20 years as a manager, never had anybody ask for a pay rise before. And here's the key thing, just because it hasn't doesn't mean it's not going to happen at some point for her or for you if you're a manager. So therefore, particularly when it's coming to annual appraisal time, make sure you've spoken to HR so you are ready if that sort of thing is asked. You can answer the questions and at least you know the processes. But here's the other catch. If you mishandle it, it can have a seriously negative effect, not only on the individual you're talking to, but there'll probably be many in the team that will be aware that that person's asking for a salary increase as well. So actually you can hit more than just that person. The worst case scenario, somebody can actually decide that they're going to leave the company. Now, don't misunderstand me here. I'm not talking about saying yes, not no. This is not a welfare decision. It is how you handle it, and particularly how you handle if the answer is no. Now, for most people, most managers, somebody comes and asks them they want a salary increase. This is the immediate thought that's going to go through your brain, like a rabbit caught in headlights. And so this is fundamentally what we don't want. So we're going to cover some important points for you. So what to do at that stage? Well, the most important part of being a leader at any time is actually to take the time to listen and let people build their case and inform you. So whatever you do, be neutral when these interviews are happening, because if you're giving the impression of being really keen, then you're setting the wrong expectation. Because you've done your research before, hopefully also you'll understand the sort of timelines that we're talking about. Now, I've said listen here. You don't want to be sat there like a dummy as well. A key part of being a leader is asking key questions. So you want to get to the root causes of the issue and understand everything that person's really wanting. So dig down deep. But whatever you do, be neutral whilst you're doing it. Now, here's something. If you're the sort of leader that has spent the past few years over-assessing people because you're not prepared to have that conflict in the discussion, then it's highly likely at some point somebody is going to ask you for a salary raise who would never be able to get a salary raise in a million years. And these things come home and they bite you. So whatever you do, write good, honest annual appraisals, so that you don't get caught out. So it's likely that somebody who's actually deserving of a raise might actually come to you. But once you've got that request, you take it seriously and you have to do your due diligence. You've got the information, hopefully in a pack, from this person. So you need to actually compare across the company as well. Is it true that in one side of the company, people are being paid far more for the identical job? And how does it compare against the market? So you do your due diligence and research and you build up the case. This will be particularly important if you're not the person that decides yes or no, because ultimately if it's yes, then you've got to go to a board or to HR and you've got to convince somebody else. So be absolutely sure of what you're doing, be sure of the facts, be sure of the data, because your job, if you think it's a reasonable request and needs to be honoured, is to give it the best possible chance that it's got. Conversely, if you don't agree with it, then you really do have to prepare as well. And that's just as important because you have to reply and respond. Why? No. Things also you have to look for, again, is the employee's value. And as I mentioned before, for the employee, actually, what happens if we lose this person? Are they the key player that we really cannot afford to lose? Are there alternatives? Now, this should come out in the discussions you have, and that's the whole point of asking the questions. So you're trying to scope out what else they're talking about. It might not be just one thing, but have a feel. But if it's no, but you might be some other alternative that might soften the blow, do you want to do that? And you need to look at alternatives and then make a decision. So you're calculating a reasonable package that you think for that request. Remember, of course, as I've said, the individual is asking for themselves, but you're actually making a case that could affect the whole company. So it's not just the individual. If the answer is no, but you think the person could get yes in time, then it's really important you understand and have a pathway to explain what that is and set those goals up and actually set them as goals within your annual appraisals so they can be assessed, so they know when they've reached that required point. And it does need to be in writing, not verbally, because you need to honour them. If somebody does something that you say, if you do X and Y, you will get a pay raise, and they do X and Y, you better honour it, and that's why it needs to be in writing. But you need to, whatever it is, yes or no, you need to respond in a logical way. And why do I say this? The next slide, when I did my research, I was horrified at the figures that are coming up, and but you'll see why now. So 33% of people actually weren't given any reason; they were just told no, and that was the end of the discussion. Interestingly, for a manager, 23% weren't believed why no was given. And of course, I mentioned about the way that you handle a negotiation. You can see these things are not going to help, but actually 70% were looking elsewhere because of the handling of the no. Not because they were told no, because of the handling of it. Now, you do not want to be a manager that's in any one of these bubbles. So that's the point while I'm bringing them up. So take it seriously and give it your best possible shot, even if you're handling no. Do it in an honest way. So key takeaways then for managers. First and foremost, be good at writing reports and write them honestly. Do not set false expectations with people because you weren't prepared to tell them they were doing an average job rather than an above average job in your reports. Be professional, be a good leader, listen, get the data, and you actually have to then make a clear decision and understand and prepare the case of why you've come to that decision. And importantly, if it's no, but there's a yes, what needs to be put in place to get to yes? And I also say as well, if it's no and there's no chance of it ever being a yes, then you should be honest and say that as well. I think that's part of leadership. Okay, that's the end of the brief. And now what I'm going to do is come to the discussion point. And as I've mentioned before, because we had problems recording the webinar, I'm going to flick now. I've got the questions on a piece of paper that were asked during the webinar, and therefore I'll answer them now in the way, much the same way as I answered in the webinar. Okay, so I have a number of questions that were from the webinar, and what I'll do is work my way through the questions that were asked at the time. And the first question I was asked was, so once accepting an offer, taking a job, how long should I wait until I ask for my next raise? Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer because, of course, it depends on each and every situation. Remember what I said, you don't have an automatic right to ask for a raise. There may be incremental that comes with every annual raise. I don't know. But it may be that you find out that what was advertised in the job and what you're actually doing are totally different. And that would be a perfectly reasonable reason to raise the issue of a salary change there. Indeed, in my last job, it was quite clear to me at 6 weeks after entering the job, I remember writing to the director and saying, sorry, but what was advertised, what you've asked for, what you're actually doing, there's a clear mismatch here in what you're asking. So things like that can be the trigger for that request for salary. But it's not a matter of time. If you imagine if the market stays the same and you're being paid the same wage and there's no other changes, you can go on indefinitely with no wage increase because there's no real reason or argument to argue for that increase. So let's have a look at the second question, and this is where I'm putting my glasses on. How to deal with killer reply from your chief. He wants to be fair and treat everyone in the team in the same way and on the same scales. Yeah, you can come across this quite often, and I understand the idea of playing fair. First of all, it might not be your manager's rationale that it has to be this way. It may be mandated this way. In fact, I spoke about pay bandings in my brief, and I remember from my time at Amazon that there's a level 6 gets paid X, that's it. So it's not going to change in comparison to the other level 6s. But also remember that you're arguing in a logical way while you're doing something over and above, or why the salary you have at the moment isn't quite correct. Correct because of extra responsibility, extra value you're bringing, or because the market has changed and the company just isn't paying at the market rate. So again, If we're talking about being fair, that's also to be fair. But remember, when you're asking for a raise, you're talking about you yourself, the individual, and the whole of the management has this requirement to think of a bigger picture as well. But ideally, of course, what you're wanting is that it's fair and equitable and everyone is happy. So, third question, what kind of questions can we ask to determine a company's available range for the position we're applying for? Well, you're obviously not going to be blunt and say, what is the wage range that you've got? However, you should have a good feel of what the company, how the company is doing at the moment, and particularly with COVID. Is the company doing well or not? That might give you an idea of the greater range. You should have an idea of what the going rate is in the market. For all I know, you may have actually phoned up the person that's leaving the job and asked them what the wage was beforehand, and you may have got a reply, you may not. But like any negotiation, and it doesn't matter whether you're buying something in the marketplace or not, you have to use your research, your skills to try and work out what's valuable to them. But if you've accurately gauged your value, then you know you've got your starting point, and hopefully by discussions and negotiations, you'll get that zone of overlap closer and closer together, and then you'll be able to come to that point where everyone is happy in the negotiation. Should you tell an application when asked what our salary expectations are, or better to just say open to negotiations? Well, actually, I covered this in the brief, and many times if you say open to negotiation, that's okay to a certain point. But remember that people are trying to act as a filter to whittle down to the number of people they're looking for to actually get to negotiations, and that would be a small number. So at some point, you're going to have to commit to a range. And in fact, many forms won't allow you to even put negotiable. So you've got to remember that as well. So from starting at the job, you need to be thinking quite clearly about what am I looking for there and what's reasonable without being outrageous. Okay, the question I was asked was, what if the company already has a cap? Is it okay to negotiate? Well, if the company has a cap, it's very unlikely that your manager is actually the one that said that there is the pay cap, probably from higher up. And you need to be prepared for your manager to try and go, there's a cap. Why are you asking for trying to negotiate an increase? We all know that there is no increase possible. Now that then may play into your value decision of do I stay with the company or not? But that's a totally different argument. But if there's a cap, there's a cap. So you shouldn't be negotiating through it. Yeah, this was quite a good question I was asked last night. So is it true that negotiating with your direct manager is better than negotiating with HR? I would always answer yes here, because if I was your line manager and you had gone around me to HR to ask for a wage increase, I'd be pretty disappointed. I'd be thinking I'd failed as a leader for a start, because there must be some reason why you wouldn't want to talk to me about it. Quite probably, actually HR are going to be wondering why I'm not the one that's talking with them as well. Now that doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't go to HR and ask them questions about what is the process, so you understand how things take. Is there a formal way of doing it? Is there a particular time of the year when these things may be done? That's very different to actually trying to negotiate a wage increase with HR. And I would always say that if you do it with your line manager, he's invariably going to be the person, or she, the person that will, if they think it's a valid case, be the ones that are pitching it at the higher level anyway. And it might be that they're pitching to HR. And a manager, because they know you better, or because they're dealing with you day in, day out, will actually be a more logical person to fight your case. Now, they may fight your case with HR, but I would always recommend going to your line manager. And definitely, it is embarrassing if the first he hears about, or in my case, I would be really embarrassed if the first I heard that somebody had asked for a wage increase was by going to somebody else. I really think there's a problem in the working relationship there. So how and when Shall I ask for a raise when I'm employed not directly with where I work, but via a recruitment agency? I actually found this quite a difficult question to answer last night. Initially, I've been thinking about it today, and the bottom line is, who pays your wage? Is it a recruitment agency or is it the place that you're working? Because that's the pressure point that you want to be negotiating the wage increase. Now, it may be that you're entitled to that increase through the recruitment company, and then they would negotiate to get more money from whoever you're working to offset that. But that's not your problem. So it should be directly with who you're doing business with. And we have a final question that was asked from me last night, and it was, how do I negotiate a salary increase if I'm in an organization that has no HR policies, it has no annual assessments either? How do I actually go forward for a salary increase? And I wondered, what sort of organizations might that be? My first answer, obvious one, might be in a startup mentality. So you're so small, you've never had to create these sorts of things. In a way, that's really good because you should know everything that's going on, because everyone's supposed to be agile. Then actually just bringing up the subject with whoever is the founder and saying, hey, look, I think I see what's going on, and I think I need some more. Maybe that sort of way of doing it. But you might be in a bigger organization that doesn't have these policies in place. But that doesn't mean to say that if you're a leader, you shouldn't just do it anyway. I'm a firm believer in mid-year reports as well as the final annual appraisal. And the reason I believe in it is because if you have somebody who's underperforming, at the 6-month point when you tell them this, they actually have 6 months chance to recover from it and to make the changes. If the first they hear there's a problem is at the annual appraisal time, it's way too late. So be prepared if you're a manager and leader to set up your own system that can do it. And that may be the part of the problem, that the HR has been so hollowed out, these things are missing. Well, somebody has to be a leader and somebody has to take it on and somebody has to start it. But if you're an employee in that situation, then you might ask yourself, is this sufficient a problem that I might want to be looking elsewhere at another company? There is a flip side to that, though, and that is if there is no policy, then that might actually play well for you as well, because then you're asking your manager directly and they may be able to immediately grant that salary increase. But having said that, I think my personal tendency is I'd be feeling quite uncomfortable working in some reasonable sized organization that doesn't have policies and doesn't have ways of assessing. How do I know if I'm doing a good job or not? And more importantly, how am I going to, if I'm looking somewhere else, be able to say that I'm doing a good job to meet certain value figures? Anyway, that's what I think. So that's the completion of this webinar as part of Maastricht School of Management's Masterclass. I hope it's been useful for you. Let's say we had to re-record it, so it misses some of the spontaneity that you get from the questions being answered. I get that. But somewhere in there might be some hidden gems. And I've covered from trying to get a job, through asking for a salary increase, or being a manager. So actually there are points here that, depending on where you are, could be really valuable for you for the rest of your careers. So I hope you found it useful. Now we at Maastricht, in our degree courses, cover negotiation in a large way, and we can also come and conduct bespoke in-company training as well. So if you're interested in anything like that, please have a look at our website, and hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you again. Bye.